Ragnar Bloodaxe had just ordered his first battle axe on Amazon Prime. Within hours, it would destroy his civilization forever. The year is 793 AD. A mysterious tablet washes up on a Norwegian beach. Ragnar touches it once. The screen lights up with an impossible promise. Anything you desire, delivered in one day. He speaks a single word: sword. 24 hours later, the most advanced weapon in human history appears at his doorstep. No blacksmith, no months of forging, no skill required, just point, click, and receive perfection. But here's what Ragnar doesn't know yet. He's just triggered the collapse of Viking civilization. Within a generation, his people will forget how to fight, how to build, how to survive. They'll become completely helpless without their magical delivery service. And when that service suddenly goes dark for 3 terrifying days, most of them will die. This is the story of what happens when the world's most self-reliant warriors become completely dependent on something they don't understand. This is what happens when Vikings get Amazon Prime. Now, before we dive into this alternate timeline, let's establish what Viking life was actually like in 793 AD. These weren't just random barbarians running around with axes. Despite what Hollywood might have you believe, Vikings were sophisticated traders, skilled craftsmen, accomplished sailors, and yes, formidable warriors. Their society was built on a complex web of relationships, skills, and traditions that had evolved over centuries. Take Ragnar himself. At 35 years old, he was considered a relatively young jarl, or chieftain, but he had already earned his reputation through a combination of successful raids, fair trading, and wise leadership. His hands bore the calluses of countless hours at the forge, where he had learned to shape iron into tools and weapons. His arms showed the rope burns from years of handling ship rigging in all weather conditions. His keen eyes could read the subtle changes in cloud formations that predicted storms days in advance. Ragnar's longship, the Sea Wolf, was a masterpiece of Viking engineering. Every piece of oak had been carefully selected and seasoned. The iron nails that held it together had been forged by his own smiths. The woolen sail had been woven by the women of his village, each thread spun from sheep that grazed on his lands. The ship represented not just transportation, but the combined skills and efforts of his entire community. This morning, like every morning for the past 15 years, Ragnar had risen before dawn to inspect his equipment and plan the day's activities. Summer was approaching, which meant raiding season. His warriors were already beginning their preparations, sharpening weapons that had been carefully maintained through the long winter, checking armor for weak points, and mentally preparing for the dangers ahead. His wife, Astrid, was equally busy. A formidable woman in her own right, she managed not just their household, but the complex network of relationships that kept their community functioning. While Ragnar focused on external threats and opportunities, Astrid ensured that food was preserved, clothing was mended, children were educated in essential skills, and the endless tasks of daily survival were completed. Their eldest son, Eric, was now 16 and eager to prove himself on his first major raid. He had spent years learning to fight with sword and axe, to handle a longship in rough seas, and to read the signs of weather and enemy movement. More importantly, he had learned the Viking code of honor. Courage in battle, loyalty to one's companions, and the understanding that a man's reputation was his most valuable possession. Their daughter, Freydis, was 14 and already showing exceptional skill at weaving and textile work, but she was also learning the fighting skills that Viking women were expected to master. In a society where men might be away for months at a time, women needed to be capable of defending their homes and families. Freydis could handle a spear as well as she could handle a loom. The younger children, Olaf and Ingrid, spent their days learning the countless skills that would keep them alive in a harsh world. How to identify edible plants, how to track animals, how to predict weather, how to start fires in wet conditions, and how to make basic tools from whatever materials were available. This was the world into which the mysterious tablet had suddenly appeared. A world where survival depended on knowledge, skill, and the strength of community bonds. A world where every tool was precious because someone had spent hours creating it by hand. A world where trade relationships were built on personal trust and reputation, carefully cultivated over years or even decades. But as Ragnar held the glowing tablet, all of this was about to change. The device seemed to respond to his touch, and the flickering symbols suddenly resolved into something resembling runic script. Though somehow he could understand their meaning, despite never having seen these particular symbols before. "Greetings, warrior of Midgard," the tablet seemed to speak directly into his mind. "You have been chosen to experience the wonders of Asgard Prime. the divine delivery service that can bring the treasures of all 9 realms to your doorstep. Simply speak your desires, and they shall be fulfilled faster than Sleipnir can cross the Rainbow Bridge. Ragnar nearly dropped the device. As a man who had traveled widely and seen many strange things, he was not easily impressed. But this seemed like genuine magic, the kind that existed in the stories told by the skalds around winter fires. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, then spoke tentatively to the tablet. I seek a sword. A blade worthy of a jarl, sharp enough to cut through chainmail, balanced perfectly for my hand. The tablet pulsed with soft light, and new symbols appeared. Your request has been processed. 1 Excelsior battle blade, rated 5 stars by customers across the realms, will be delivered to your location within 1 day. Cost: 0 gold pieces for your trial membership of Asgard Prime. Subsequent deliveries will require payment, but your first month is completely free. Ragnar stared at the device in amazement. Free? Nothing in his world was ever free. Every transaction required careful negotiation. Every favor created an obligation. Every gift demanded a reciprocal gesture. The concept of receiving something valuable without immediate payment was almost incomprehensible. He spent the rest of that day in a state of nervous anticipation, going through the motions of his normal routine, while constantly thinking about the tablet's promise. He sharpened his existing weapons, checked his armor, and discussed raiding plans with his lieutenants. But his mind kept wandering to the impossible possibility that a perfect sword might simply appear. Astrid noticed his distraction immediately. After 20 years of marriage, she could read her husband's moods better than he could read the weather. What troubles you, husband? You seem elsewhere today. Ragnar considered telling her about the tablet, but the story seemed too fantastic. Instead, he deflected, just thinking about the upcoming season. The Franks have been strengthening their coastal defenses. We may need to look for new targets. But Astrid was not so easily dismissed. She had seen the strange tablet when Ragnar brought it into their longhouse, and she had noticed how his behavior changed afterward. As the sun set and they shared their evening meal with their children, she watched him constantly glance toward the shore, as if expecting something to emerge from the waves. That night, as promised, something did emerge. Not from the waves, but from the sky. A craft unlike anything the Vikings had ever seen descended from the stars, silent except for a low humming that seemed to resonate in their bones. It was sleek and metallic, shaped vaguely like a longship, but with no oars, no sail, and no visible means of propulsion. The entire village gathered on the beach, weapons in hand, as the strange vessel settled gently onto the sand. For long moments, nothing happened. Then a section of the craft's hull opened with a soft hiss, revealing a cargo compartment filled with soft, glowing light. Inside, wrapped in materials finer than the silk that occasionally made its way north from Byzantium, was the most beautiful sword any of them had ever seen. The blade caught the moonlight and seemed to hold it, creating a subtle luminescence along its perfectly straight edge. The crossguard was intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift and flow as they watched. The grip was wrapped in leather so soft it felt like touching water, yet provided perfect traction for even the sweatiest palm. Ragnar approached cautiously, half expecting the sword to disappear if he touched it. But when his fingers closed around the grip, the weapon felt absolutely perfect. It was neither too heavy nor too light, neither too long nor too short. It was as if the sword had been made specifically for his hand, his arm, his fighting style. The villagers gasped as Ragnar lifted the blade. Even in the dim moonlight, they could see that this was not just a weapon, but a work of art that surpassed anything their best smiths had ever created. The balance was so perfect that the sword seemed weightless. When Ragnar swung it experimentally, it cut through the air with a soft whistle that spoke of razor sharpness. "How is this possible?" whispered Bjorn the smith, the village's master metalworker. He had dedicated his life to perfecting his craft, and he could immediately see that this blade was beyond his capabilities. The steel was somehow both harder and more flexible than anything he had ever worked with. The tempering was so perfect that the blade showed no stress patterns at all. The edge was so fine. The change was most dramatic among the warriors. For centuries, Viking fighters had distinguished themselves through their skill with personally crafted or carefully selected weapons. Each warrior knew his equipment intimately, understanding exactly how his sword would behave in different situations, how his shield would respond to various attacks, how his armor would protect him while still allowing freedom of movement. But now, warriors were receiving equipment so superior to traditional gear that skill became less important than simply having access to the best orders. Young men who had never learned proper sword technique, could defeat experienced fighters simply by ordering better weapons. The careful balance between different fighting styles was disrupted as everyone began using identical, perfectly optimized equipment. The disruption extended beyond individual combat to the entire structure of Viking military organization. Traditional warbands were small, tight-knit groups where every member had a specific role based on their particular skills and equipment. But when everyone had access to the same perfect gear, these specialized roles became meaningless. Worse, the traditional Viking approach to warfare emphasized adaptability and resourcefulness. Warriors were expected to be able to fight effectively even when their primary weapons were damaged or lost, using whatever was available. But the new generation, dependent on their ordered equipment, became helpless when separated from their perfect tools. The economic implications were even more far-reaching. Traditional Viking society was built on a complex network of interdependent specialists. Smiths created weapons and tools. Carpenters built ships and buildings. Weavers created clothing and sails. Farmers provided food. Traders brought in materials that couldn't be produced locally. Everyone had a role, and everyone's contribution was valued and necessary. Asgard Prime began to undermine this entire system. Why maintain a relationship with a local smith when you could order better weapons delivered overnight? Why support local farmers when exotic foods could be delivered from anywhere? Why invest time and effort in learning traditional skills when superior results could be obtained instantly? The social fabric that held Viking communities together began to unravel. Young people saw no point in the long apprenticeships that traditional crafts required. Why spend years learning to forge iron when perfect steel could be ordered with a few words? Why master the complex art of navigation when maps and instruments could be delivered that made sailing foolproof? Ragnar began to notice these changes within his own family. Eric, once eager to learn traditional warrior skills, became obsessed with finding ever more powerful weapons and armor through Asgard Prime. Instead of practicing with sword and shield for hours each day, he spent his time browsing the seemingly infinite catalog of available equipment. "Father," Eric said one morning, "why should I waste time learning to fight with inferior weapons when I can simply order the best? Look at this catalog entry. Berserker's Bane Battle Axe, capable of cutting through any armor, never needs sharpening, rated 5 stars by 10,000 satisfied customers. Why would I use grandfather's old axe when I can have this?" Ragnar tried to explain the importance of understanding one's equipment intimately, of being able to fight effectively even with imperfect tools, of the satisfaction that came from mastering difficult skills. But Eric was unimpressed. "Those are old ways, father. The gods have given us a better path. Why cling to tradition when we can embrace progress?" Similar conversations were happening throughout the village. Freydis, once proud of her weaving skills, now left her loom to gather dust while she experimented with automatically produced textiles. Olaf, the youngest, showed no interest in learning to hunt or track when he could simply order whatever food he wanted. The changes weren't limited to practical skills. The entire Viking value system was built around concepts of personal achievement, earned reputation, and proved competence. But when anyone could acquire the trappings of success through Asgard Prime, these values became meaningless. Traditional Viking heroes were remembered for their deeds, battles won through courage and skill, impossible voyages completed through determination and seamanship, communities led through wisdom and fair judgment. But the new generation seemed more interested in being remembered for having the most impressive orders, the highest customer ratings, or the most exotic items in their collections. The storytelling tradition that preserved Viking culture began to change as well. Instead of sagas celebrating heroic achievements, the Skalds found their audiences more interested in hearing about amazing products available through Asgard Prime, successful ordering strategies, and tips for getting faster deliveries. Religious practices were also affected. Traditional Viking religion emphasized the importance of earning the favor of the gods through brave deeds, wise leadership, and skilled craftsmanship. But if the gods themselves were providing perfect goods through Asgard Prime, what was the point of trying to earn their approval through human effort? Some Vikings began to interpret Asgard Prime as a sign that Ragnarok, the end of the world, was approaching. They believed that the gods were distributing their treasures because the final battle was near, and earthly possessions would soon be meaningless. This led to increasingly frantic ordering as people tried to acquire as much as possible before the world ended. Others developed a more optimistic interpretation. They believed that Asgard Prime represented the dawn of a golden age, where humans would no longer need to struggle for survival. Work and effort would become obsolete as the gods provided everything needed for a perfect life. Both interpretations had the same practical effect. traditional Viking culture began to disappear. The skills, values, and relationships that had sustained Nordic peoples for centuries were abandoned in favor of dependency on the mysterious delivery service. The transformation wasn't uniform across all Viking communities. Some regions embraced Asgard Prime more quickly and completely than others. Coastal areas with strong trading traditions adapted faster than inland communities that were more focused on farming and local production. Younger people adopted the service more readily than their elders. Wealthy families could afford more orders and became more dependent, while poorer families maintained more traditional practices out of necessity. These differences began to create new forms of social division. Communities were split between Prime Vikings, who had fully embraced the delivery service, and Old Way Vikings, who clung to traditional methods. Marriages between families from different groups became complicated, as they had completely different approaches to basic aspects of life. The divide was particularly pronounced among the warriors. Traditional fighters viewed the Prime Vikings as soft and dependent, lacking the hardiness and self-reliance that made true warriors. Prime Vikings saw the Old Way fighters as stubborn and backward, clinging to inefficient methods when superior alternatives were available. These tensions came to a head during the raiding season. When various Viking groups attempted to coordinate their traditional summer campaigns, they discovered that their different approaches to warfare were completely incompatible. The Old Way Vikings arrived with traditional equipment and tactics, expecting to work together as they had for generations. They brought weapons they had crafted or carefully selected over years, armor they understood intimately, and strategies based on centuries of experience. The Prime Vikings arrived with superior equipment, but little understanding of how to use it effectively in coordinated group combat. Their individually perfect weapons were optimized for different fighting styles and couldn't be used together effectively. They had become accustomed to fighting alone rather than as part of a coordinated unit. The first major disaster occurred during an attempted raid on a Frankish monastery. The combined Viking force was larger and better equipped than any in history, but they couldn't function as a coherent unit. Prime Vikings kept stopping mid-battle to check their tablets for better equipment they could order. Old Way Vikings found their traditional signals and formations useless when half the force was using unfamiliar weapons and tactics. The confusion was so complete that the vastly outnumbered Frankish defenders were able to repel the attack easily. Worse, several Viking ships were captured when their crews spent too much time arguing about whose equipment was superior rather than focusing on navigation and seamanship. News of the failed raid spread quickly throughout the Viking world. The psychological impact was devastating. Vikings had built their entire cultural identity around their reputation as fearsome and effective raiders. The idea that they could be defeated by inferior forces because they couldn't work together effectively struck at the heart of their self-image. Some communities responded by doubling down on Asgard Prime, convinced that they simply needed better equipment. Orders became more frequent and more extreme as Vikings sought increasingly powerful tools to compensate for their declining skills and coordination. Others began to question whether the mysterious delivery service was really the gift it appeared to be. These doubts were reinforced when several communities experienced their first service disruptions. The problem started small. Occasional delayed deliveries, items that didn't match their descriptions, customer service representatives who seemed to know less and less about the products they were selling. But gradually, the issues became more serious. Quality control began to deteriorate as the volume of orders increased. Weapons arrived with flaws that weren't immediately apparent, but caused them to break during critical moments. Armor that looked perfect proved to have weak points that enemies quickly learned to exploit. Food deliveries occasionally contained spoiled or contaminated items. More troubling was the gradual realization that the Vikings had no recourse when problems occurred. Traditional trade relationships were built on personal accountability. If a local smith created a flawed weapon, he would repair or replace it to maintain his reputation. But Asgard Prime operated through mysterious intermediaries who couldn't be held directly accountable. Customer service, initially responsive and helpful, became increasingly automated and unhelpful. Vikings found themselves speaking to what seemed like magical constructs rather than actual people. These entities could recite standard policies but couldn't address specific problems or provide personalized solutions. The language barrier also became an issue. As Asgard Prime expanded to serve other cultures, the customer service began defaulting to languages that Vikings couldn't understand. Instructions became confusing, and product descriptions often didn't match what was actually delivered. Even more concerning was the gradual increase in costs. The initial free trial period ended, and Vikings found themselves paying increasing amounts for deliveries. But by then, they had become so dependent on the service that they felt they had no choice but to continue paying. The subscription model proved particularly insidious. Vikings found themselves signed up for recurring deliveries of items they didn't really need, but couldn't bring themselves to cancel. Battle-ready breakfast box delivered exotic foods monthly. Warrior's Wardrobe provided new clothing seasonally. Raiders' Reading Collection shipped books and scrolls regularly. Each subscription seemed reasonable individually, but collectively they represented a significant drain on resources. Worse, canceling subscriptions proved surprisingly difficult. The process required navigating complex menus on the tablets, often in languages that Vikings couldn't read fluently. Some Vikings found themselves trapped in subscription spirals, ordering new services to help them manage their existing subscriptions. Subscription management solutions promised to handle cancellations for a fee. Order organization optimization claimed to help streamline deliveries. Prime Account Personal Assistant offered to handle all aspects of Asgard Prime interaction. These meta-services created additional dependencies and costs, while solving very few actual problems. Vikings became customers not just of Asgard Prime itself, but of an entire ecosystem of services designed to help them cope with their dependence on the original service. The psychological effects were profound. Vikings who had once prided themselves on their independence and self-reliance became anxious and helpless when separated from their tablets. A delayed delivery could cause experienced warriors to panic. Technical problems with the ordering system could trigger severe depression. Children growing up during this period never learned the basic skills their ancestors had taken for granted. They couldn't start fires without ordered fire-starting kits. They couldn't prepare food without pre-processed ingredients and specialized tools. They couldn't make simple repairs without ordering specific replacement parts. This generation became completely unable to function when Asgard Prime experienced problems. During even minor service disruptions, they were left helpless, waiting for normal operations to resume rather than finding alternative solutions. The cultural knowledge that had sustained Viking civilization for centuries began to disappear. Oral traditions that preserved important survival information were forgotten, as people became convinced that all necessary knowledge could be ordered when needed. Traditional songs and stories were replaced by product reviews and ordering tutorials. Skills that had been passed down through generations were lost in a single lifetime. Master craftsmen found no one interested in learning their trades. Expert navigators discovered that young sailors preferred to rely on ordered instruments rather than learning to read natural signs. Experienced hunters and farmers watched their knowledge become irrelevant, as food could be delivered on demand. The loss was most dramatic in medicine and healing. Traditional Viking healers possessed extensive knowledge of local plants, natural remedies, and medical techniques. But when healing potions and medical supplies could be ordered from Asgard Prime, people stopped learning these traditional skills. When injuries or illnesses occurred that required immediate attention, communities found themselves helpless if their ordered medical supplies were delayed or unavailable. Knowledge that could have saved lives was lost because everyone assumed it would be available for purchase when needed. The environmental knowledge that allowed Vikings to thrive in harsh northern climates also began to disappear. People stopped learning to predict weather patterns, identify safe shelter, find water sources, or recognize the signs that indicated when winter preparations needed to begin. This knowledge loss created dangerous vulnerabilities. Communities became dependent not just on ordered goods, but on the assumption that those goods would always be available. They had no backup plans for situations where the delivery system might fail. The first major test of these vulnerabilities came during what became known as the Great Asgard Prime outage. The event began without warning. On a cold autumn morning when tablets throughout the Viking world suddenly went dark. At first, people assumed it was a temporary glitch. Similar minor disruptions had occurred before, usually lasting only a few hours. Vikings went about their daily routines, expecting service to resume shortly. But hours turned into days, and the tablets remained unresponsive. The mystical delivery vessels stopped arriving. Orders placed before the outage were not fulfilled. Customer service became completely unavailable. The initial reaction was confusion and annoyance. Vikings who had planned their schedules around expected deliveries found themselves scrambling to adjust. Communities that had ordered essential supplies for the approaching winter suddenly faced shortages. But as the outage continued, confusion turned to concern and then to panic. People realized just how completely dependent they had become on the delivery service. Food stores were nearly empty because everyone had been ordering fresh supplies as needed. Tool supplies were depleted because broken items were normally replaced by ordering rather than repairing. Fuel for heating and cooking was running low throughout the Viking world. Traditional methods of gathering wood and other combustible materials had been abandoned in favor of ordering processed fuel. But without deliveries, communities faced the prospect of cold, dark winters without the knowledge needed to gather materials naturally. The situation was most desperate in communities that had embraced Asgard Prime most completely. These groups had dismantled their traditional production and storage systems, confident that they could order whatever they needed when they needed it. Now they found themselves with no local capacity to produce essential goods and no stored supplies to tide them over. Individual families faced their own crises. Parents realized they couldn't feed their children because they had never learned to hunt, fish, or gather wild foods. They had no tools for food preparation because their kitchens contained only specialized implements that they had ordered for specific purposes. Clothing became a critical issue as autumn weather turned colder. Most Vikings had disposed of traditional woolen clothing in favor of superior materials ordered through Asgard Prime. But without deliveries, they had no way to stay warm. The few people who still knew how to spin wool and weave cloth found themselves overwhelmed by desperate neighbors begging for help. Medical emergencies became life-threatening situations. Communities that had become dependent on ordered medical supplies had no way to treat injuries or illnesses. Traditional healers had either died or been ignored for so long that their knowledge was effectively lost. Children suffered disproportionately during the outage. The generation that had grown up with Asgard Prime had never learned basic survival skills. They didn't know how to dress appropriately for cold weather, how to find and prepare safe food, or how to stay healthy without modern medical supplies. The psychological impact was as severe as the practical problems. Vikings who had once been renowned for their resilience and adaptability found themselves paralyzed by situations their ancestors would have handled routinely. The confidence that had made them effective raiders and explorers evaporated when they realized how helpless they had become. Some communities attempted to organize collective responses to the crisis. They tried to pool their remaining resources and assign people to essential tasks. But these efforts were hampered by the fact that most people lacked the knowledge needed to contribute effectively. Attempts to restart traditional production methods failed because the necessary tools, materials, and expertise were no longer available. Forges had been abandoned and were now too corroded to use. Workshops had been converted to other purposes. The master craftsmen who could have supervised production had either died or forgotten their skills. Even basic tasks like food preparation became major challenges. People who had been ordering pre-processed meals didn't know how to butcher animals, preserve meat, or cook over open fires. Families that had been surviving on delivered exotic foods couldn't identify which local plants were safe to eat. The social bonds that had once helped communities weather difficult times had also deteriorated. Traditional Viking society was built on networks of mutual obligation and support, but the convenience of Asgard Prime had made these relationships seem unnecessary. Neighbors who had once helped each other now barely knew each other's names. Attempts to recreate traditional cooperation were complicated by the fact that different families had become dependent on different aspects of the delivery service. Some had focused on weapons and military equipment, others on luxury goods, still others on basic necessities. No one had maintained the broad range of skills that would have been normal in traditional Viking communities. The crisis was made worse by the realization that no one understood how Asgard Prime actually worked. The tablets were mysterious devices that had appeared without explanation. No one knew where the goods were produced, how they were transported, or why the service had suddenly stopped working. This ignorance made it impossible to predict when or if service would resume. Communities found themselves making desperate preparations for a winter that might last indefinitely, with no way to know whether their efforts would be sufficient. Some groups attempted to contact other cultures that might have maintained traditional skills, but travel had become difficult without the navigation instruments and supplies that were normally ordered through Asgard Prime. Traditional Viking ships had been modified to accommodate ordered equipment and could no longer function effectively with improvised alternatives. The few successful expeditions brought back disturbing news. Other cultures that had embraced similar delivery services were experiencing the same problems. The Frankish kingdoms, Irish monasteries, and even distant Byzantine cities were all struggling with the same mysterious outage. This revelation was particularly troubling because it suggested that the problem wasn't limited to Asgard Prime, but affected some larger system that connected all these services. The implications were staggering. Perhaps the entire known world had become dependent on a single vulnerable system. As the outage stretched into its third week, the first deaths began to occur. Elderly people and young children were most vulnerable to the cold, hunger, and disease that resulted from the breakdown of normal supply systems. Communities that had once been prosperous and secure found themselves struggling with humanitarian crises. The psychological toll was severe. Warriors who had faced death in battle without flinching found themselves consumed by anxiety about their family's survival. Parents who had confidently provided for their children through Asgard Prime felt overwhelming guilt about their inability to meet basic needs. Some Vikings began to interpret the outage as divine punishment for abandoning traditional ways. They saw it as a test from the gods, a challenge to return to the values and practices that had made their ancestors strong. This interpretation led to desperate attempts to recreate traditional rituals and practices, often based on incomplete or distorted memories. Others became convinced that the outage represented the beginning of Ragnarok. They believed that the end of the world had begun and that all their struggles were futile. This fatalistic attitude led some communities to give up entirely, waiting passively for death rather than fighting for survival. A few communities took a more practical approach. They organized expeditions to search abandoned workshops and storage areas, hoping to find forgotten tools and materials. These efforts met with limited success, but they did uncover some useful items and, more importantly, sparked memories of traditional techniques. The rediscovery process was slow and frustrating. People who vaguely remembered their grandparents performing certain tasks tried to recreate them based on fragmentary recollections. Many attempts failed, sometimes disastrously, but gradually some practical knowledge was recovered. Ironworking was one of the first traditional skills to be partially restored. Several communities found old forges that could be repaired and put back into service. The first attempts at making new tools were crude and ineffective, but they provided hope that self-sufficiency might be possible. Food production was more challenging because it required not just knowledge, but also appropriate seeds, breeding stock, and preparation for the next growing season. Communities that attempted to restart farming had to work with whatever materials they could find, often using inappropriate techniques based on incomplete understanding. Hunting and fishing were somewhat easier to resume because the basic techniques were relatively simple and the necessary tools could be improvised. However, people who had never learned to track animals or read natural signs struggled to be effective. Many hunting expeditions returned empty-handed, wasting precious energy and resources. The process of relearning traditional skills was complicated by the fact that different people remembered different fragments of knowledge. Successful restoration required combining partial memories and filling in gaps through experimentation. This collaborative approach began to rebuild some of the social bonds that had been weakened by dependence on Asgard Prime. Children proved to be particularly adaptable during this crisis. While adults struggled to abandon their habits of dependence, young people were more willing to experiment with new approaches. They became crucial bridges between the elderly people who retained some traditional knowledge and the adults who had the physical strength to implement solutions. Gradually, some communities began to achieve basic self-sufficiency. They couldn't replicate the comfort and convenience they had enjoyed during the Asgard Prime era, but they could meet their fundamental needs for food, shelter, and warmth. More importantly, they began to regain confidence in their ability to survive independently. But just as these communities were beginning to stabilize, Asgard Prime suddenly came back online. The tablets flickered back to life. Customer service became available again, and the mystical delivery vessels resumed their regular appearances. The restoration of service created a new crisis. Communities were split between those who wanted to immediately resume their dependence on Asgard Prime, and those who had learned to value the self-reliance they had rediscovered during the outage. Families found themselves divided. Parents who had struggled through the crisis were determined never again to be caught so unprepared. But children who remembered the convenience and luxury of the delivery service were eager to return to those easier times. The younger generation was particularly conflicted. They had experienced both the helplessness of complete dependence and the satisfaction of gradually mastering traditional skills. Some had discovered that they enjoyed the challenge and creativity required for self-sufficient living. Others had found the uncertainty and hardship unbearable and wanted to return to the security of ordered goods. Communities that had successfully rebuilt their traditional capacities faced difficult decisions. Should they maintain their hard-won self-sufficiency even though it required continued effort and sacrifice? Or should they return to the convenience of Asgard Prime while trying to preserve the knowledge they had rediscovered? The decision was complicated by the fact that maintaining traditional skills required constant practice and community commitment. If even a few families returned to depending on delivered goods, the social structures needed for self-sufficiency would be weakened. Some communities attempted compromise solutions. They would maintain basic production capabilities while using Asgard Prime for luxury items and specialized goods. But these approaches proved unstable. The convenience of ordering gradually eroded the motivation to maintain traditional skills. Other communities made clean breaks, either returning completely to Asgard Prime or rejecting the service entirely. Both approaches had their advocates and their problems. The communities that returned to Asgard Prime quickly regained their previous standard of living, but they also resumed their previous vulnerabilities. They found themselves once again dependent on a system they didn't understand and couldn't control. The memory of the outage created constant anxiety, but the convenience of the service was too tempting to resist. The communities that rejected Asgard Prime faced different challenges. They had to work much harder to meet their basic needs, and their standard of living remained significantly lower than what they had enjoyed during the peak of the delivery service era. But they also experienced a sense of security and self-respect that came from knowing they could survive independently. The cultural implications extended beyond practical skills to fundamental values and worldviews. Traditional Viking culture emphasized the importance of personal achievement, earned reputation, and proved competence. But these values became complicated when superior results could be obtained through ordering rather than effort. The concept of honor, central to Viking identity, became confused and contested. Was it more honorable to struggle with inferior traditional tools, or to achieve better results using ordered equipment? Did victory in combat count if it was achieved primarily through superior gear rather than superior skill? These questions divided communities and generated heated debates that sometimes led to violence. Religious interpretations of these dilemmas varied widely. Some Vikings believed that the gods intended for humans to use whatever tools were available, including those provided through Asgard Prime. They argued that refusing divine gifts was itself a form of dishonor. Others maintained that the gods valued effort and struggle, not just results. They believed that achieving goals through personal skill and determination was spiritually superior to obtaining the same outcomes through delivered assistance. Still others developed more complex theological interpretations. They suggested that Asgard Prime represented a test of character rather than a simple gift. According to this view, the gods were observing how humans responded to easy abundance, and the appropriate response was to use the service wisely while maintaining traditional virtues. These religious debates influenced practical decisions about how to balance traditional methods with delivered goods. Communities with different theological interpretations developed different policies, creating additional sources of division and conflict. The military implications of these cultural changes became apparent during the next raiding season. Viking war bands that had once been unified by shared values and methods now struggled with internal conflicts over equipment, tactics, and objectives. Traditional warriors insisted on using time-tested methods and equipment, arguing that proven techniques were more reliable than untested innovations. Prime warriors countered that superior equipment provided decisive advantages that would be foolish to ignore. These debates weren't merely theoretical. Different types of equipment required different fighting techniques and coordinated tactics. Mixed groups found it nearly impossible to function effectively because they couldn't coordinate their approaches. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that prime equipment, while individually superior, wasn't always compatible with traditional group tactics. Weapons optimized for individual combat didn't work well in shield wall formations. Armor designed for maximum protection hindered the mobility required for traditional Viking fighting styles. Attempts to develop new tactical approaches that could accommodate both traditional and prime equipment were largely unsuccessful. The time and practice required to develop effective new methods wasn't available during the relatively short raiding season. Most experiments resulted in confused and ineffective combat performance. The failure of mixed tactical approaches forced warbands to choose between traditional methods and prime-based approaches. This choice often split long-standing military alliances and destroyed relationships that had been built up over years or decades. Traditional warbands found themselves at a significant disadvantage in direct combat against prime-equipped opponents. Their weapons and armor were clearly inferior, and their opponents had access to capabilities that traditional methods simply couldn't match. Prime war bands had advantages in individual combat situations, but struggled with coordination, logistics, and adaptability. They were dependent on their ordered equipment and became ineffective when it was damaged, lost, or unavailable. Both approaches proved vulnerable to opponents who had maintained traditional skills while selectively adopting Prime technologies. These hybrid groups could use superior equipment when it was available, but fall back on traditional methods when necessary. The most successful military groups during this period were those that had completely integrated Prime technologies while developing new tactical doctrines, specifically designed around their capabilities. But these groups required extensive resources and training time that most Viking communities couldn't provide. The raiding season results were mixed and confusing. Some Prime-equipped groups achieved spectacular successes against opponents who weren't prepared for their superior capabilities. Other Prime groups suffered humiliating defeats when their equipment failed or they encountered situations their training hadn't prepared them. Traditional groups found their usual targets increasingly well prepared, as other cultures also gained access to delivery, services, and defensive technologies. Monasteries that had once been easy targets now had access to advanced warning systems, superior fortifications, and well-equipped defenders. The overall impact was a decline in the effectiveness of Viking raiding as the economic and military strategy. The advantages that had made Vikings successful raiders, superior seamanship, better weapons, coordinated tactics, and strategic surprise, were eroded by the widespread availability of competing technologies. This decline had profound economic implications for Viking society. Raiding had been a crucial source of wealth, exotic goods, and strategic resources. Communities that depended on raiding income found themselves facing serious financial pressures. The problem was compounded by the ongoing costs of Asgard Prime subscriptions. As raiding income declined, communities had to choose between maintaining their standard of living and maintaining their military capabilities. Most chose to preserve their subscriptions, which meant reduced investment in ships, weapons, and warrior training. This created a downward spiral where reduced military investment led to less successful raids, which generated less income to support military activities. Communities that had once been prosperous raiding centers found themselves struggling to maintain basic capabilities. Some communities attempted to pivot from raiding to other economic activities, but they faced significant obstacles. Traditional Viking agriculture was limited by climate and soil conditions. Crafts production was undermined by competition from delivered goods. Trading was complicated by the fact that potential partners also had access to delivery services. The most viable alternative seemed to be providing services related to Asgard Prime itself. Communities began specializing in customer service, order fulfillment, delivery logistics, and subscription management. These activities provided income, but created new forms of dependency. Vikings who had once been independent raiders and traders became functionaries in a system they didn't control or fully understand. They were earning income by helping others manage their dependence on the same service that was undermining their traditional way of life. The psychological impact of this transformation was severe. Vikings had built their cultural identity around concepts of independence, adventure, and personal achievement. Working as customer service, representatives, or delivery coordinators satisfied none of these values. Many Vikings experienced what would later be recognized as depression and anxiety related to their loss of purpose and autonomy. The excitement and meaning that had once come from raiding, exploring, and building were replaced by routine administrative tasks that felt meaningless and degrading. The social status associated with different occupations also changed dramatically. Traditional Vikings had highest respect for successful warriors, skilled craftsmen, and wise leaders. But in the new economy, the most successful people were those who best understood how to navigate the Asgard Prime system. Young people who showed aptitude for managing subscriptions, optimizing deliveries, and resolving customer service issues became more valued than those who demonstrated traditional skills. This reversal of social priorities created intergenerational conflict and cultural confusion. Parents who had achieved status through traditional means found themselves less respected than their children who had mastered Prime-related skills. Grandparents who possessed valuable traditional knowledge found that no one was interested in learning from them. The language itself began to change as Viking communities adopted terminology related to their new economic activities. Traditional words for craftsmanship, seamanship, and warrior skills became archaic. New vocabulary related to ordering, delivery, and customer satisfaction became central to daily conversation. Songs, and stories that had once celebrated heroic deeds and cultural values were replaced by instructional content about how to use Asgard Prime effectively. The rich oral tradition that had preserved Viking culture for centuries was gradually displaced by practical information about navigating delivery systems. Even personal names began to reflect the new priorities. Children were increasingly given names that referred to commercial success, customer satisfaction, or delivery efficiency rather than traditional virtues like courage, strength, or wisdom. The physical appearance of Viking communities also changed. Traditional workshops, training grounds, and ceremonial spaces were converted to facilities for managing Asgard Prime operations. Customer service centers replaced meeting halls. Storage areas for delivered goods displaced traditional craft spaces. The architecture itself began to reflect different priorities. Within a single generation, the knowledge that had made Vikings the premier seafaring culture of their time began to disappear. Young people who should have been learning to read wind patterns, understand tide cycles, and navigate by stars instead learned to operate delivered navigation instruments. The implications extended far beyond practical seamanship. Viking culture had developed around the rhythms and requirements of maritime life. Their social structures, economic systems, and even their religious beliefs were shaped by the demands of sea-based activities. When these activities became automated or unnecessary, the cultural foundations they had supported began to crumble. Communities that had been organized around the needs of shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime trade found themselves without clear organizing principles. The seasonal patterns that had structured Viking life for centuries also became irrelevant. Traditional society had been built around the cycle of winter preparation, spring planning, summer raiding or trading, and autumn consolidation. But when goods could be delivered year-round and weather was less of a constraint, these natural rhythms lost their significance. Without seasonal imperatives to coordinate community activities, social cohesion began to deteriorate. People who had once worked together intensively during crucial periods of the year found themselves living increasingly independent lives. The loss of shared challenges and objectives meant that communities had fewer reasons to cooperate and coordinate their efforts. Individual families could meet their needs through Asgard Prime without relying on their neighbors, so the social bonds that had held communities together weakened. This social atomization had political implications as well. Traditional Viking governance had been based on assemblies where community members made collective decisions about shared challenges. But when people no longer faced shared challenges, they had less reason to participate in collective decision-making. Political leaders who had once derived their authority from their ability to coordinate community responses to common problems found their roles becoming irrelevant. Why participate in lengthy discussions about resource allocation when individuals could simply order what they needed? The decline of political engagement meant that communities were less able to respond effectively to collective challenges when they did arise. The skills and institutions needed for democratic governance atrophied from disuse. This political weakness became apparent when communities faced decisions about how to respond to the changes brought by Asgard Prime. Groups that might have been able to develop coherent strategies through traditional political processes instead fragmented into competing factions. The inability to make collective decisions about fundamental issues created additional instability and conflict. Communities split along lines of individual preference rather than working toward solutions that could accommodate different perspectives. International relations also became more complicated as Viking communities lost their coherent identity and political structures. Other cultures found it difficult to negotiate with groups that couldn't speak with unified voices or make binding commitments. Traditional diplomatic relationships, built up over generations, dissolved when Viking communities could no longer fulfill their obligations or maintain consistent policies. Allied groups found themselves dealing with fractured societies that changed their positions frequently and unpredictably. Trade relationships, which had been crucial to Viking prosperity, became confused and unreliable when communities couldn't coordinate their production or maintain quality standards. Partners who had once relied on Viking goods found alternative suppliers through their own delivery services. The cumulative effect of these changes was the gradual dissolution of Viking civilization as a coherent cultural entity. Communities that had once shared common values, methods, and objectives became collections of individuals, pursuing separate agendas with increasingly divergent approaches. The diversity that had once been a source of strength. Different communities specializing in different activities while maintaining shared cultural foundations became a source of fragmentation when the shared foundations disappeared. Some historians argue that this cultural dissolution was inevitable once Vikings became dependent on external systems they couldn't control. Others maintain that different choices could have led to better outcomes, with Vikings successfully integrating new technologies while preserving their cultural identity. The debate is complicated by the fact that the changes happened gradually and weren't recognized as problematic until they had already become entrenched. By the time communities realized what they had lost, the knowledge and institutions needed to reverse course had already disappeared. Individual attempts to return to traditional ways were generally unsuccessful because they required community-wide coordination and support. Isolated families or small groups couldn't maintain traditional lifestyles when surrounded by communities that had embraced different approaches. The few successful reversions occurred in remote areas where communities had maintained more traditional practices and could support each other in rejecting Asgard Prime. But these groups became increasingly isolated as the broader Viking world moved in different directions. Even these traditional communities faced pressure to abandon their approaches when they interacted with other groups. Their children were exposed to the superior goods and easier lifestyles available through Asgard Prime, creating internal pressure to adopt new methods. The generational tension was particularly intense in these holdout communities. Young people who had been raised with traditional skills but were aware of alternatives often felt constrained and resentful. Many left their communities to join groups that had embraced Asgard Prime. This brain drain further weakened traditional communities by removing the young adults who would have been crucial for maintaining traditional practices. The remaining populations became increasingly elderly and less capable of sustaining demanding traditional lifestyles. The final collapse of traditional Viking culture wasn't marked by any single dramatic event. Instead, it was a gradual process where traditional practices, values, and institutions slowly became irrelevant and were abandoned. The last traditional shipyard closed not because it was shut down, but because no one remembered how to operate it, and no one needed its products. The final mastersmith didn't retire dramatically. He simply found that fewer and fewer people were interested in learning his craft until eventually, no one came to his workshop. Traditional festivals and celebrations continued for a while, but they gradually became hollow performances rather than meaningful cultural expressions. People went through the motions of traditional rituals without understanding their significance or feeling connected to their original purposes. The stories and songs that had preserved Viking culture for centuries continued to be told, but they became increasingly disconnected from people's lived experiences. Young people heard about heroic warriors and skilled craftsmen, but had no context for understanding what these figures had actually done or why it mattered. Eventually, these traditional narratives were replaced by new stories about successful Prime users, innovative ordering strategies, and customer service victories. The cultural memory that connected Vikings to their heritage was gradually overwritten by new priorities and concerns. The transformation was so complete that within 2 generations, most Vikings had only vague awareness of what their culture had been like before Asgard Prime. The skills, values, and institutions that had defined their civilization for centuries became historical curiosities, rather than living traditions. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the physical remains of this transformation. Traditional tools and weapons appear in refuse piles, discarded when they were replaced by delivered alternatives. Workshop spaces were converted to storage areas for prime goods. Burial practices changed as traditional grave goods were replaced by delivered items. The environmental impact was also significant. Traditional Viking practices had been developed over centuries to work sustainably within northern European ecosystems, but the delivered goods came from unknown sources using unknown methods, often with much higher environmental costs. The mystical delivery system itself had environmental consequences that weren't immediately apparent, but became significant over time. The energy required to transport goods across vast distances, and possibly between different realms, created disturbances that affected local ecosystems. Wildlife patterns changed as animals adapted to the regular appearance of delivery vessels. Plant growth was affected by the residual magical energies left by frequent deliveries. Water sources sometimes became contaminated by runoff from delivery landing sites. These environmental changes made traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering less reliable, which further increased dependence on delivered goods. Communities found themselves trapped in cycles where environmental degradation made traditional practices less viable, forcing greater reliance on the systems that were causing the degradation. The health implications were also complex and long-term. While delivered medical supplies initially improved health outcomes, the loss of traditional knowledge about nutrition, herbal remedies, and preventive health practices created new vulnerabilities. Delivered foods were often more convenient and appealing than traditional diets, but they weren't necessarily better adapted to local conditions and seasonal needs. People who had once eaten foods that were optimal for their climate and lifestyle began consuming products designed for different environments and activity levels. The psychological health impacts were perhaps most severe. Vikings had evolved cultural practices that provided meaning, purpose, and social connection within their specific environment and lifestyle. When these practices became irrelevant, people struggled to find alternative sources of fulfillment. The rates of what would now be recognized as depression and anxiety increased significantly during the transition period. People who had once derived satisfaction from mastering challenging skills found themselves bored and restless when everything became easy. Social relationships became more superficial. When people no longer needed to cooperate intensively to meet their basic needs, the deep bonds that had formed around shared challenges and mutual dependence were replaced by more casual connections based on consumer preferences and delivery schedules. The mental health impacts were particularly severe for people who had achieved mastery in traditional skills. Master craftsmen, experienced warriors, and skilled navigators found their expertise suddenly worthless. The identity and self-respect that had been built around these abilities were undermined when the abilities themselves became obsolete. Younger people faced different, but equally serious psychological challenges. They grew up without the character-building experiences that had traditionally shaped Viking personality and values. The patience, persistence, and resilience that came from mastering difficult skills were never developed when everything could be obtained instantly. This psychological weakness became apparent during the Great Outage, when young adults who had never faced serious challenges found themselves completely overwhelmed by relatively minor hardships. Their grandparents' generation had routinely endured difficulties that left their descendants paralyzed with anxiety. The recovery period after the outage provided some opportunity for psychological healing and growth. People who successfully learned traditional skills during the crisis experienced increased confidence and self-respect. Communities that worked together to solve problems rebuilt some of their social cohesion, but the psychological damage couldn't be completely undone. The cultural knowledge that had once provided frameworks for understanding hardship and finding meaning in struggle had been lost. People had to rediscover these insights individually, rather than inheriting them as part of their cultural heritage. The final lesson of this alternate history might be that technological convenience, no matter how beneficial it appears, comes with hidden costs that may not be apparent until it's too late to avoid them. The Vikings' experience with Asgard Prime illustrates how quickly and completely a culture can be transformed when it becomes dependent on systems it doesn't understand or control. The story also demonstrates the importance of maintaining traditional skills and cultural practices even when they seem obsolete. The communities that survived the Great Outage most successfully were those that had preserved at least some traditional knowledge, even when it seemed unnecessary. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking experience shows that true strength and security come not from having access to the best tools and materials, but from developing the personal capabilities and community relationships that can adapt to changing circumstances. In the end, the mystical tablets were found buried throughout Scandinavia, deliberately hidden by the few Vikings who had learned to recognize their dangers. These devices were sealed away with runic warnings for future generations. Beware the gifts that seem too good to be true, for they may cost more than you know how to pay. The Vikings who carved these warnings had learned through bitter experience that independence and self-reliance, though difficult to maintain, were more valuable than any convenience that could be delivered to their doorsteps. They discovered that the greatest treasures were the skills, relationships, and cultural knowledge that no external system could provide or replace. And so this alternate timeline serves as a cautionary tale about the seductive power of convenience and the hidden value of traditional ways. It reminds us that every technological advance involves trade-offs, and that sometimes the greatest wisdom lies in understanding what to refuse, not just what to accept. The Vikings learned this lesson too late to save their civilization, but their story can serve as a warning for others who might face similar choices in their own times and places. For in the end, no delivery service, no matter how efficient or comprehensive, can deliver the things that matter most: character, community, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building your own life with your own hands.